I was at a quiet cafe recently when I noticed a young guy, maybe 22, staring at his phone with a look of absolute cold indifference. He wasn't scrolling for memes or, chasing a dopamine hit. He looked more like a weary auditor staring at the books of a bankrupt company. And when the News on the Wall started a segment on the crisis of young men failing to launch, he didn't get angry or defensive. He just let out this short, dry laugh, the kind of sound someone makes when they finally realize the game they're playing isn't just rigged, but that the prize isn't even worth the entry fee anymore. To most observers, he's just a symptom of modern laziness, or maybe a toxic rightward drift. But if you look closer, his silence is actually a profound ledger audit. He's a digital native who has crunched the numbers on the modern gender contract and found it fundamentally broken. He sees a dating market governed by an algorithmic sexual Gini coefficient that leaves the vast majority of men in a state of perceived genetic obsolescence. He sees an institutional landscape where equality feels less like fairness and more like a redistributive cudgel aimed at his future. What we are seeing isn't a political tantrum, it's a behavioral sink, a mass, nonviolent non-cooperation. It's the visceral shock of a Stone Age brain trying to survive in a hyperinflated algorithmic age, where the traditional bargain of male provision for social status has been unilaterally voided. That young man isn't dropping out because he's weak. He's performing a rational exit from a system that has stopped offering a return on investment. As these men become ghosts in the machine, the very foundations of our social cooperation are beginning to shear. Why has the modern man decided that the only winning move is not to play? And what happens to a civilization when its builders finally decide to walk away?
That is the essential, chilling question hanging over modern society. This topic is arguably one of the most complex, charged, and emotionally difficult conversations happening today, because it addresses genuine structural failure, not just moral or political feelings. We're trying to move past the tired political slogans and look directly at the underlying data that suggests these young men are indeed performing a legitimate ledger audit. That feeling of genetic obsolescence or institutional disenfranchisement isn't arbitrary. It's a raw, system-generated feedback report that needs to be analyzed scientifically.
So our mission today is ambitious. We need to cut through all that noise and really analyze the structural, the algorithmic, and the biological forces that are driving this massive social and economic withdrawal among young men. It's not enough to talk about the symptoms, right? We need the deep roots.
Absolutely. And to understand this rational exit, we have to recognize the three interconnected drivers we've identified. First, we have to analyze the hyper-competitive digital dating market and how these proprietary algorithms are not just matching people, but actively generating and amplifying massive inequality in romantic opportunity. They're essentially hyperinflating the cost of entry for the average man.
Which raises the question of whether this inequality is, an accident or if it's a feature of the business model itself.
Precisely. The second driver we'll tackle is the framework of evolutionary mismatch and the behavioral sink. We need to connect our ancestral psychology, that Stone Age brain you just mentioned, to these modern systemic failures. How is chronic global competition short-circuiting our biological programming?
And finally, we will analyze what this resulting social atomization, the men becoming ghosts in the machine, what that means for future social cooperation, for the economy, and ultimately for the long-term health of our civilization. It's about the rational calculations these men are making.
Let's start with the immediate, quantifiable problem. The hard numbers of the digital landscape that govern modern courtship.
Okay, let's unpack this. For many young people, especially Gen Z, dating apps are not just an option for finding a partner. For many, they have become the primary and often the only viable marketplace for romantic relationships. When these technologies first came out, they were straightforward, almost like a digital bulletin board to facilitate real-world meetups. But something fundamental, something commercially driven, changed their function over time.
The shift was almost undetectable to the user, but it was entirely profound for the business model. Dating apps evolved from being neutral facilitators of connection to becoming, highly optimized engines of match accumulation and continuous user engagement, all designed for revenue maximization. You have to consider the economic incentive structure here. Unlike, say, Netflix or Instagram, which benefit from keeping you glued to the screen, a dating app benefits most when you are perpetually searching, perpetually frustrated, and most importantly, perpetually paying.
Which means a successful, enduring offline encounter is actually an economic failure for the platform. It's the moment they lose a paying customer.
That is the critical point. Data shows that men form the largest demographic of paid subscribers to these platforms. They're often subscribing to advanced features that promise to let them be seen or gain some kind of priority. The conjecture is therefore pretty straightforward. These companies are motivated at a fundamental commercial level to keep their paying customers who are predominantly men on the platform for as long as possible. If the app successfully mediates an enduring, exclusive relationship, that consistent revenue stream is just gone. Yeah. Instantly.
So the goal isn't connection. The goal is sustained hope mixed with sustained friction. It's a balancing act.
It creates what we call the casino effect. The entire process has been gamified to trigger gambler tendencies. You get the quick, small hit of a match to keep you playing, followed by long periods of frustration that compel you to buy more chips-like boosts, super likes, or premium subscriptions just to overcome the artificial friction.
Help me understand the mechanism behind that friction. Is the app actively throttling matches, or is this just a natural market dynamic that gets amplified by the app's structure?
It's a combination. But the design strongly implies engineered friction. The algorithms have to precisely strategize the reward. Just enough to maintain hope and encourage compulsive checking and purchasing, but not so high that the user actually achieves success and leaves the platform entirely. If the user leaves, the revenue stream stops. This results in what researchers are calling match throttling. It's a form of behavioral control intended to extend the customer life cycle. You are being rewarded just enough to keep coming back, but not enough to get what you want.
It sounds like a system that's literally built to monetize frustration, and the data that comes out of it shows this massive gender disparity.
The disparity is overwhelming, and it's the core of the problem. On one end of the spectrum, you have studies showing that a significant minority of women, often those perceived as highly attractive, report being inundated. They get so many matches, messages, and choices that selection becomes difficult. It leads to choice paralysis. On the opposite end, the vast majority of men are receiving very few responses and are compelled to purchase those expensive paid features just to gain a limited priority.
And this situation quantifies the problem, which brings us to the concept of the sexual Gini coefficient. For our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, what is the Gini coefficient traditionally, and how does it apply here?
Well, the Gini coefficient is a standard economic metric. It's used to measure income or wealth inequality within a nation or group. A score of 0 represents perfect equality. Everyone has the same income. A score of 1 represents maximum inequality, where one person has all the wealth.
So if we apply that to the dating market, we're basically measuring the distribution of romantic or sexual attention?
Precisely. The sexual Gini coefficient measures romantic inequality. In traditional, local, real-world dating markets, that coefficient was relatively low. Attention and opportunity were distributed somewhat evenly across the population. But in these massive digital marketplaces, that coefficient is skyrocketing. The data shows that the distribution of attention follows an extreme Pareto principle. A small percentage of the most desirable profiles receive the overwhelming majority of attention and matches.
So we're talking about an attention economy where, say, the top 10% of users might be receiving 80% or more of the inbound interest, leaving the other 90% of users to compete for scraps. And the vast majority of users who fall into that 90% are men.
That's the reality revealed by the platform data. It confirms that the system creates and amplifies this inequality. And this isn't just organic user preference. The algorithms are actively designed to perpetuate this, often through something called popularity bias.
Okay, tell us more about that. How does the algorithm actively push this bias?
Well, empirical analysis shows that popularity bias affects close to 80% of major dating platforms. Here's how the feedback loop works. The recommendation system learns that certain profiles, those with high initial desirability or popularity metrics, generate the most user engagement, likes, swipes, whatever. So to maximize overall platform engagement, the algorithm systematically favors these popular users, showing them more frequently and earlier in the stacks of other users.
So the rich get richer, digitally speaking?
Correct. The popular profiles get more exposure, which generates even more matches, which the algorithm interprets as a signal of high quality, which then makes the algorithm show them even more. It completely marginalizes almost everyone else. This creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop that effectively concentrates romantic opportunity in the hands of a few while driving the sexual Gini coefficient toward 1.
And I imagine this extends beyond just simple metrics of attractiveness.
It absolutely does. Algorithms learn from historically biased user behavior, and in doing so, they perpetuate racial and demographic biases. This impacts a large portion of the systems that have been analyzed. If users in one specific demographic consistently swipe left on another demographic, the algorithm learns this as a preference and just stops showing those profiles to avoid wasting a swipe or a user session. This contributes significantly to the filter bubble effect, trapping users in narrow preference patterns and perpetuating segregation in digital spaces based on race, age, and socioeconomic class. They're learning our societal prejudices, even the subconscious ones, and amplifying them through technology.
This is where the data really shits the kitchen table, and it relates directly to the account of the young man I mentioned at the start. I came across the account of a young financial analyst, let's call him Elias, who essentially performed what he called a structural exhaustion audit on his entire life based on this exact algorithmic reality.
This is crucial. This illustrates the correlation between that rising sexual Gini coefficient in the digital dating market and the systemic withdrawal of Gen Z men from traditional socioeconomic participation. So, how did this person, Elias, connect the dots between his career and his dating life?
Well, Elias, he's 24, and by all traditional metrics, he was a success story. He had the degree from a good university, and he landed a highly sought-after 60-hour-a-week analyst job in a major city. He had done everything the old social contract demanded: work hard, climb the ladder, and material success would guarantee social status and romantic access. But when he looked at the return on investment, the traditional reward of social and romantic connection, he found it was, in his words, statistically gated behind an unreachable algorithmic wall.
So the status he was earning in the physical world was failing to translate into status in the digital marketplace.
Exactly. He had achieved the material means, but the social capital it traditionally bought was being arbitrarily distributed by systems he couldn't influence through hard work alone. He crunched the numbers and realized the stress, the social sacrifice, and the emotional toll of the rat race were nonsensical if the ultimate prize, a stable partnership and family life, was systematically blocked or hyperinflated in cost.
And his reaction wasn't to double down on his effort, to try even harder.
No. His response wasn't anger or entitlement. It was an incredibly cold, rational calculation. A cost-benefit analysis where the cost 60 hours of high-stress labor vastly outweighed the perceived benefit, which was a non-existent social and romantic return. So he performed a rational exit. He quit the high-stress job, moved into a low-stress part-time consulting role, adopted a minimalist lifestyle, and dramatically reduced his engagement with the traditional socioeconomic engine. His goal shifted from accumulation to self-sufficiency and low burnout.
That decision to withdraw from the high-status, high-stress socioeconomic competition is one of the most profound symptoms of this digital inequality. Why would you invest 60 hours a week in competitive labor, which often requires social sacrifices, if the social capital it traditionally buys is now being distributed by an algorithm that effectively excludes you and rewards metrics you can't easily change?
It also feels like we are just ignoring a huge public health crisis that's hiding in plain sight here.
Researchers are increasingly viewing this as a major public health concern. You have to consider this. The majority of the young adult population relies on these apps for social connection, and the current setup, which generates manufactured scarcity, is directly impacting mental health. Studies are directly linking the frequency and length of dating app used to significantly higher rates of depression, body image issues, and anxiety, particularly for men who experience the lowest match rates.
When you are constantly putting yourself out there only to face statistical manufactured rejection, that has to take a deep psychological toll.
It absolutely does. The brain has not evolved to handle rejection at this scale. When you consider that surveys estimate clinical depression and anxiety are affecting significant portions of the young adult population, the role these algorithms play in driving feelings of loneliness, worthlessness, and social redundancy presents a major public health concern. This feeling of being statistically gated translates into real-world psychological distress.
And the regulatory recommendations are becoming quite clear. That action is needed to disallow match throttling and these pay-for-advantage models just to ensure fair conditions. That would mitigate the disproportionately negative impact on young men's psychological profiles and stabilize the market.
If that action isn't taken, we risk creating a large, depressed, and anxious population. This generation, which is already facing unprecedented economic uncertainty, is being psychologically sabotaged by the very tools they are using to seek connection. The failure isn't just in their dating lives. It fundamentally affects their well-being and their ability to be productive, engaged members of society overall.
That's a powerful connection between digital design and real-world suffering. So if the modern environment is failing them on the digital level, Let's pivot and look deeper at the biological and sociological level, the evolutionary mismatch. This takes us back to our primal programming.
This is a critical conceptual lens, and it helps us understand why the psychological distress is so acute. Evolutionary mismatch is defined by the fundamental friction between our evolved physiology and psychology and the hyper-technological, hyper-social environment we now inhabit. Our human mechanisms, the ways we regulate stress, seek reward, and determine social status, evolved over millions of years to handle very specific ancestral environments.
Right. Small tribes, few resources, immediate fleeting threats. Not chronic. 247 global comparison.
Exactly. Now, picture that famous analogy. The cheetah that evolved to roam the vast high-stakes Serengeti, but suddenly wakes up in a zoo cage. The environment had changed too fast for our psychological mechanisms to adapt. Our systems were designed for localized competition among maybe 150 people, not chronic, globally visible competition against millions of curated profiles on social media.
And this mismatch is directly related to so many modern epidemics. Chronic stress, anxiety disorders, high rates of inflammation. Our ancient programming is just overloaded.
It is a systemic overload.
Yeah.
I mean, consider our ancient calorie-obtaining mechanisms. They optimized for seeking high-energy sugar and fat because resources were scarce. Now we overload on cheap processed sugar, leading to obesity and diabetes. Similarly, our evolved mechanisms for social bonding and status seeking are overloading on hyperstimuli, leading to chronic anxiety and social breakdown.
But how does this relate specifically to this crisis of male withdrawal and reproduction? What's the biological calculus that tells a young man to stop pursuing a mate?
For that, we turn to life history theory. This is a robust biological framework that explains how organisms expend their limited energy budget based on perceived environmental conditions. Energy is allocated toward three major paths: maintenance, which is survival; growth, development; or reproduction, mating and parenting.
And what determines the split? How the energy is divided?
Environmental cues. When conditions are perceived as favorable, low population density, stable resource abundance, low chronic stress, the organism shifts energy toward fast reproduction. But when conditions are perceived as unfavorable, characterized by high population density, intense competition, resource instability, or chronic, high-visibility social threats, organisms shift their energy away from mating and toward long-term growth, resource investment, or simply survival.
So the hyper-competitive, globally visible social arena of the modern world, especially the algorithmic dating market we just discussed, is essentially one giant chronic signal to the ancestral brain that current reproduction is a bad bet.
It constantly signals unfavorable, high-risk conditions. This mechanism, which was calibrated for successful reproduction in the ancestral past, gets stuck in a perpetual state of delay in the modern world. Even when people are physically and financially capable of having children, the psychological engine is signaling caution. This is so evident in developed East Asian countries like Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, which now have the lowest birth rates globally. Despite massive economic progress, the excessive social status striving, fueled by materialism and global social comparisons, leads to a delay in family formation and ultimately dangerously low fertility rates. The energy is channeled into the endless high-stress rat race instead of relational pursuits.
This inability of our ancestral mechanisms to cope with hyperdensity and chronic competition, it brings us to the chilling ideas of Dr. John B. Calhoun's experiments and the concept of the behavioral sink. I remember these studies being deeply provocative when they were first published.
Calhoun's work in the 1960s and 70s provides a startling framework for understanding modern social collapse under conditions of extreme psychological density, even when physical resources are abundant. He created these experimental universes-bounded physical spaces with ample food, water, and shelter for colonies of mice. He just wanted to see how this pathological crowding affected social behavior over generations.
And the core insight was that the problem wasn't scarcity of material goods, but the scarcity of effective social space.
Precisely. Calhoun's most famous experiment, Universe 25, reached a peak population where resources were unlimited, but social roles became impossible to fulfill. The defining structural breakdown was what he called the behavioral sink. This wasn't just overcrowding, it was the breakdown of effective social interaction due to pathological proximity.
Okay, help us visualize how the behavioral sink developed. What did that actually look like?
Well, the term describes a specific catastrophic kind of social breakdown. It developed when localized, highly desirable situations, like a single centrally located food hopper, caused a derived heightened need for proximity to others. The mice began congregating pathologically in massive numbers at that one hopper, even though identical food was available in less crowded peripheral areas. The sheer concentration made basic tasks difficult. Fighting often broke out, yet they continued to aggregate. They had redefined the eating situation as requiring the presence of an associate, even if that associate was aggressive or disruptive.
So the crowding wasn't just physical, it was social, an overload of sensory and social data that the individuals couldn't process effectively.
And the consequences for the social fabric were devastating, particularly for the male population. Normal interactions, aggression, which is what defines territoriality and social hierarchy, and reproductive competence collapsed entirely. Generations of effective adult behavior templates were just washed out.
And this produced the famous withdrawn individuals he called the beautiful ones.
Yes, the beautiful ones. These were solitary, inactive mice that showed no interest in social, aggressive, or reproductive activity. They spent their days grooming themselves obsessively, detached from the communal chaos. And critically, they were physiologically unique. They had large fat deposits, but small adrenal glands, which reflects a lack of necessary stress hormones because they had completely opted out of the competitive social framework. They made absolutely no contribution to the reproductive survival of the species, lacking any awareness of their associates despite their constant physical proximity.
That is the truly chilling insight for our modern deep dive. The high density didn't just cause fighting. In fact, the high initial density actually reduced territorial fighting and led to a higher terminal population. But the cost was the total loss or non-development of behaviors appropriate for species survival. The templates for effective adult behavior provision, protection, courtship, and parenting were effectively purged from the population.
In essence, the behavioral sink is a result of having too many social contacts per unit of time, which leads to the contacts becoming brief, incomplete, and ultimately meaningless. This sensory and social overload blocks the expression of necessary social and reproductive behaviors, leading to mass withdrawal. The parallel to young men overwhelmed by algorithmic competition and unclear social rules today is, well, it's striking.
It provides a powerful framework for understanding withdrawal as a biological and sociological consequence, not just a moral failing. We've covered the algorithmic crunch and the biological framework. Now let's look at the rational exit these men are performing from the economic and social systems they were supposed to join. The digital dating market isn't the only ledger they're auditing.
The economic data confirms a broad systemic withdrawal that echoes that story of Elias, but on a macro scale. Traditionally, a college degree was the guaranteed ticket to upward mobility. But the data shows Gen Z men with college degrees now face unemployment rates around 5.5% to 6.9% that are statistically equivalent to their non-graduate peers in many sectors. This is the clearest possible signal of a collapse in the long-assumed degree premium.
Right. The ROI on the four-year degree is just evaporating, especially when you weigh it against the crushing debt that comes with it.
And young men have noticed this structural shift. We've seen a steep decline in college enrollment, specifically among men. It's dropped by 1.2 million since 2011, with men accounting for a staggering 1 million of that overall decline. This is the rational exit in action. They are disillusioned with the perceived gatekeepers of status.
This withdrawal leaves a large number of young men in a pretty uncertain space.
It does. About 11% of Gen Z men are now classified as NEETs, not in employment education or training after prolonged, frustrating job searches that yield little reward and often carry significant social debt, like student loans. They're deciding that the traditional academic and corporate tracks are a poor investment.
So where are they pivoting their energy, if not to the traditional four-year track?
The pivot is toward verifiable competence and immediate income. We've seen a significant surge, a 20% increase since 2020, in enrollment in two-year vocational programs for trades. Things like welding, carpentry, electrical work, mechanics. This shift recognizes that tangible, demonstrable skill sets and trades are offering highly competitive wages and clear, debt-free pathways, challenging the four-year degree as the sole route to financial stability and, crucially, independence.
It's a return to prioritizing function over credentials. But beyond the economics, there is this fundamental feeling that the entire modern social contract is broken and has left them structurally exposed.
Many men perceive the modern gender contract as having collapsed unilaterally. We have to remember that, historically, the traditional bargain was male provision economic and protective value in exchange for social status, recognition, and familial sovereignty. That provision obligation has been selectively retained, often repackaged as systemic guilt or increased legal and financial liability, while the promised status and recognition have been removed entirely.
This leads us to the profound and difficult structural problem of institutional exclusion, or what some call institutional misandry, which really exacerbates the withdrawal.
That's right. When policies institutionalize outdated gender roles, reinforcing mothers as the default primary carers and fathers solely as detached providers, it creates structural barriers that harm everyone, especially fathers seeking to maintain connection and emotional involvement. For instance, policies in welfare, housing support, and family law often exclude shared care fathers from essential supports like childcare assistance or housing aid that is often tied to the primary caregiver status, who is disproportionately assumed to be the mother.
Can you give us a concrete example of how a father might be structurally excluded by that kind of policy design?
Sure. Consider housing or financial aid programs designed for low-income parents. Often, the qualification criteria are based on a singular household unit with a primary caregiver designation. A father who shares 50-50 custody but maintains a separate residence may be excluded from receiving the same essential support like subsidized childcare or priority housing access that a mother receives, simply because the policy framework cannot acknowledge or accommodate the modern model of shared active fatherhood. It makes it economically punishing for men to prioritize caregiving over traditional provision.
I recently heard about a guy, let's call him Marcus, who's 26. And his experience perfectly encapsulates this feeling of structural exhaustion and exclusion. It brings this abstract policy failure into sharp focus.
And this specific illustration really highlights how institutional misandry and the erosion of the traditional social contract can trigger a modern behavioral sink, characterized by this male social atomization and stoic indifference. What was Marcus's turning point?
Well, Marcus was a mid-level manager in tech, doing the grind, chasing promotion after promotion. He believed in the meritocratic ideal. You provide value, you follow the rules, you earn your seat. But he experienced a series of subtle but profound rejections in his professional life, feeling sidelined for mentorship opportunities and, at the same time, feeling invisible in the social realm. He felt his obligations remained, the expectation to work, earn, and pay taxes, while his social and institutional status was unilaterally voided.
So he felt the system taking from him without giving the promised returns.
Absolutely. His breaking point was the realization that his investment, his emotional and labor capital, was being funneled into a rigged game. So he chose to drop the rope, stopping his social and career investment entirely. He moved to a low-cost area, stopped pursuing high-status career paths, and actively reduced his engagement with any institution that didn't provide a direct transactional return. He adopted a philosophy he called stoic indifference, a non-violent, non-cooperation strategy against what he perceived as fundamentally unjust and rigged systems. His social atomization, his turning inward, is a textbook case of the modern behavioral sink response.
And this institutional exclusion creates a tragic intergenerational cycle. When policies exclude or marginalize actively involved fathers, boys absorb harmful stereotypes that link masculinity with emotional detachment and a lack of caregiving competence because they lack supported, visible paternal involvement and emotional modeling.
The institutional structure essentially reinforces the stereotype that men are only financial providers, not emotional caregivers.
Precisely. This absence, often reinforced by policy and cultural narrative, leaves young men with unacknowledged hurt, confusion, and a lack of emotional vocabulary. This then manifests as apathy, anger, or deep withdrawal. And that makes them incredibly vulnerable to hostile online narratives that falsely promise clarity, status, and power by railing against the institutions that they feel have already abandoned them.
This withdrawal and search for a framework brings us to the concept of Stoicism itself, which has become this massive cultural trend among young men. Is this detachment a genuine survival strategy, or is it just emotional suppression that leads to greater issues down the road?
We have to make a critical distinction here between cultural, lowercase stoicism, and philosophical, capital S stoicism. The cultural version, often taught to men, the pervasive societal mandate of don't cry, don't feel, is frequently described by psychological researchers as a vice or a harmful coping mechanism. It's rooted in generations of trauma, often from war or industrial hardship, the necessity of being unfeeling, emotionally detached, and rigid just to survive atrocities or harsh working conditions.
So it becomes a generational scar passed down, where emotional suppression is mistaken for strength.
Exactly. It leads to PTSD and deep emotional illiteracy in subsequent generations, where men perpetuate the cycle without knowing why they feel they cannot show vulnerability. That is the trauma-based mechanism of cultural stoicism.
However, the resurgence of true philosophical stoicism seems to offer a different path.
Philosophical stoicism is, in fact, the antidote. The true philosophy, rooted in thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, is not about suppressing emotions or becoming emotionless. It's about rigorous self-awareness, understanding your emotions, and preventing them from controlling your rational response. It utilizes the dichotomy of control, focusing energy only on action, virtue, and reason, things that are internal and within your control, rather than fixating on external events you cannot change, like algorithmic exclusion or institutional indifference.
So, the modern adoption of Stoic detachment can be seen as a way for young men to process genuinely difficult and unfair systemic conditions and build genuine psychological resilience. It gives them a constructive framework for managing a deeply frustrating and confusing world where external rewards are sparse.
It shifts the battleground from the external world, where they are statistically disadvantaged, to the internal world, where they have absolute sovereignty. I saw the perspective of the young man, let's call him Ethan, who articulated this perfectly in terms of finding self-worth outside the system's jurisdiction.
Tell us about Ethan's perspective on psychological sovereignty and this idea of anti-fragility.
Ethan is 22, and he described the psychological toll of his brain being wired for a small tribe of about 150 people. The Dunbar number, the social network our neocortex is optimized for. But living in a global arena where he's constantly competing and comparing himself to millions of others, thanks to social media and dating apps, he viewed this overload as a form of civilizational entropy that was draining his motivation.
And his solution was withdrawal and self-cultivation.
Precisely. To combat this overwhelming feeling of genetic and social obsolescence, he disconnected from mainstream competitive narratives. He focused entirely on building psychological sovereignty. For him, this meant rigorous, measurable self-improvement, focusing on physical fitness, mastering a tangible skill through private study, and only engaging in relationships that were based on functional mutual respect rather than algorithmic status.
So he viewed fitness and private study not just as hobbies, but as building anti-fragility, securing his inner self against a world designed to make him feel obsolete.
This pivot from a paralyzing victim narrative to one of sovereign self-improvement is essential. It's a sophisticated survival strategy. He's creating his own small, effective, conceptual space, to use Calhoun's term, where he can establish clear roles, clear rules, and clear rewards based on competence and effort outside the jurisdiction of the failed socioeconomic systems. He's taking the energy that life history theory says should be channeled into high-risk reproduction and channeling it into high-certainty self-growth.
We've seen how this withdrawal operates on the individual level, the algorithmic, the biological, and the social. If we pull back to the macro view, what does this widespread behavioral sync and rational withdrawal signify for the civilization as a whole? Are we seeing more than just a cultural phenomenon here?
This gender schism and the corresponding systemic devaluation of traditional masculine virtues are viewed by historians and sociologists not as an anomaly, but as a reliable marker of late-stage societal entropy. The historian Sir John Glubb, in his analysis of the rise and fall of empires, consistently noted that the age of decadence is characterized by two things: gender confusion and the rise of internal factionalism and atomization.
The fabric of cooperation starts to fray because people lose a shared understanding of roles and purpose.
Correct. Social atomization dissolves the family unit, which in turn creates a profound macroeconomic liquidity trap. If you think about the family unit as the foundational engine of economic investment and future demand, when men are withdrawing, forming fewer families, and having fewer children, it directly impacts the demographic structure.
Fewer children means fewer future workers, fewer consumers, and fewer taxpayers to support the existing infrastructure.
It creates a vicious feedback loop. Declining family formation and fertility, which we see across developed nations, cripples future demand, innovation, and social stability. It is the fundamental structural collision between distorted digital distribution algorithms, which exclude the majority of men, and biological imperatives, which demand status and stability for reproduction. The civilizational engine runs on shared investment, and when the investors, in this case young men, decide the terms of service are too poor, the engine stops.
Let's return to Calhoun one last time to contextualize this macro consequence. Calhoun suggested that man escape the limits of physical space by creating conceptual space, values, roles, culture, and social contracts to allow group size to increase while maintaining the necessary rate of effective social interaction.
Yes. Conceptual space permitted man to increase group size far beyond the ancestral tribe of 150 because roles were clear and expectations were shared. But when individual psychological mechanisms are pushed beyond their design limits, as they are now by chronic global competition and algorithmic exclusion, the conceptual space collapses and we get the behavioral sink not in a physical pen, but in the virtual and social world.
The result is that individuals lose the capacity for effective behavior because the cultural templates for survival and cooperation are washed out.
The young men of Gen Z are responding to the voiding of the traditional contract by refusing to invest emotional or productive capital in a system they believe is fundamentally broken and rigged against them. They're becoming ghosts in the machine. They are not necessarily acting out politically. They're simply performing a rational economic and psychological audit and deciding that the only winning move is not to play.
The required pivot, then, as articulated by the young men practicing psychological sovereignty, is from a paralyzing victim narrative to the active building of anti-fragility outside the system's jurisdiction. It means cultivating competence, forging tangible community based on function and shared goals, and reclaiming psychological sovereignty over their internal world.
So we have fully unpacked the ledger audit of young men today. We found three interconnected drivers of withdrawal. The digital market's algorithmic inequality, driven by profit, which creates massive disparities in romantic attention. The evolutionary mismatch, where chronic social competition overrides ancestral reproductive timing mechanisms. And finally, the structural erosion of the gender contract and institutional failure, pushing men toward a behavioral sink response of non-cooperation.
The crisis we are observing, the men becoming ghosts in the machine, is not merely a cultural tantrum, but a rational response to economic, social, and biological incentive structures that have ceased to offer a return on investment for the average young man. The foundations of the old civilization are shearing, and the focus shifts inexorably from repairing the system to securing the sovereign self.